Hello, my friends. Today we're going to talk about a rather strange accident that happened on February 16, 2021. It was during the COVID period. An experimental plane, no less strange. And for your information, this case, like many things that happen in the United States, was covered by many American channels. Nevertheless, this video is based on original research from official documents and does not reference American videos. So, what I'm trying to say is that maybe we'll talk a bit to set the scene. We have an experimental aircraft. So the experimental aircraft is a VV-twin Velocity. Well, probably, honestly, I've never seen one up close in my life. It's a fairly rare aircraft, home-built, twin-engine, and with very unique aerodynamics. That means you have what's called a canard. Basically, you can almost imagine that the plane is laid out backwards. That means if you go from front to back, you have the elevator placed in front and the horizontal stabilizer as well. So it's literally in front of the cockpit. So when you use the elevator controls, you will see the canard move. Which one had a canard? I think it was come on, I forgot the name. The Soviet plane that was supposed to be a sort of competitor to the Concorde, it crashed at Le Bourget. I need to tell you about it sometime. It had a canard at the front. Some military planes have that too. If you go farther back, you have the wings. And then at the back, you have the engines. Typically in this plane, you have two that push instead of pull. You have two propeller engines powered by Continental brand engines. So Continental has two types of engines. They have engines, if you will, for general aviation. And they also have the so-called DTX version, which is for experimental aviation. So just between us, I'm not trying to discredit this type of aviation. But not even for a blank check would I get into an aircraft like that. Nevertheless, just to be fair, we see a lot of enthusiasts who sometimes even watch this channel and fly this kind of aircraft. I can tell you that you take it. The Boeing is not an experimental aircraft at all, is it? On the other hand, in 2020, when they did an inspection of many aircraft that hadn't been delivered yet, so they went back to aircraft that were parked waiting for delivery, especially the 737 MAX. And well, they found inside, in the tanks, for example, they found rags, they found tools, pliers, they found screwdrivers, all kinds of objects. Not just in a few planes, but in many. When they removed the inspection panels, they found plenty inside. Yet, this isn't experimental aviation at all, but you know what I mean. So this aircraft, well, when you look at it, there's a flying association for this type of plane. They describe it, and I'll tell you how they describe it. They describe it as unstallable. That means they describe this aircraft as something that cannot stall. If planes couldn't stall, this channel wouldn't exist. I know, the cemeteries are full of people who flew planes that supposedly couldn't stall. All aircraft can stall, including the Airbus, including Boeings, including experimental aircraft. Every plane in the world can stall if the conditions are right. So, how is it described? How do they imagine that this aircraft can stall? Well, it works like this. The canard at the front, well, it's set up so that its angle of attack is always more critical than that of the wing. That generally means it's higher than the wings. What does that mean? It means that if you pull back on the stick to try to stall the plane, there will come a point when the wing's angle of attack isn't in the stall zone yet, but the canard has already reached its maximum angle of attack. And it will stall first, so the nose of the plane will drop. That means even if you try to do it on purpose, you can't make it stall. That's on paper. Of course, there are ways to make it stall. For example, if you're at 1G, you just have to add some Gs. For example, you can bank it. For example, you can pull on the stick to reach the critical zone and then bank sharply. Or bank first and create asymmetry with the rudder pedals. You see, and at that point, we're going to add some factors that will make the protection I'm talking about fail pretty easily. So this aircraft was undergoing on that day, February 16th, we're in Wisconsin. This aircraft was on a rather special flight. By the way, there was a special permit from the FAA that had been issued to allow it to make this flight, which was a ferry flight. That means it had a problem. There was a problem with the landing gear. And what the FAA authorized was the right to fly it during the day in visual flight conditions with a maximum of 2 pilots on board. Even though, which is strange, because usually these special ferry permits allow the minimum number of pilots possible. If the plane can be flown by one person, as with this aircraft, only one person would be authorized on board. For some reason, they authorized 2 here. We don't know why. Maybe they just asked nicely, and then the guy from the FAA agreed to do it. That's it. We don't know. In any case, they had to fly from Wisconsin all the way to Florida to the maintenance facility. Often, when you have issues with planes, it usually falls into 2 categories, roughly speaking. If the aircraft can't fly at all, like you do an engine test and something goes wrong or whatever, at that point, it's done for. The technician has to come. So you have an aircraft that's grounded until a technician can come over. Or, in other cases, if the aircraft is flyable, well, you can get a special permit and go to a place where maintenance can be done, like in the case we're interested in today. So, up to this point, we've set the scene. The pilots, we have a pilot who is 25 years old. He's someone who has worked for an airline. He has about 1,800 flight hours, so he's experienced. There's no problem with that. On his left, which is unusual since he's the one who got the special permit. He was meant to be the pilot in command. But what's funny is that he's sitting on the right, which is typically the instructor's seat. On his left, there's a girl who is also in the Army, who has always been passionate about aviation. She's sitting on his left, okay? Accident report information. Well, there was an accident. I wouldn't be here otherwise. I can even tell you everything. There was even an autopsy. What I'm going to tell you is from the autopsy report. The girl had taken amphetamines and other substances. I'm not suggesting that she was taking them illegally, but she was probably undergoing treatment. I couldn't really tell you. Maybe something like antidepressants or similar, which she took as a long-term treatment in any case. So a treatment for a chronic condition, which meant she had a certain number of substances in her blood that are normally incompatible with being a pilot. I'm not saying she was completely out of it, that's not it. But clearly there's potentially an impact related to these substances. Unfortunately, we are seeing this kind of thing more and more often. Okay. Now here's what's going to happen. And here we have a pretty awful sequence. It's a sequence really worthy of, what's the name of that movie? That movie where people escape a plane crash and then start to Final Destination. We're really close to a scenario like that. So listen to this one. The aircraft lines up on runway 32. Okay, it's an airfield. It's after 9:12 in the morning. He gives the controller looks from his tower. He gives them clearance to take off. They had stopped to refuel. Yeah, to add fuel. They throttle up. They take off at 9:12. They begin their climb. All right, we're climbing up pretty quickly. It's an extremely capable twin-engine plane. And now, here's what's going to happen. Literally within about a minute, maybe a minute and a half. Almost at the same moment, literally, what will happen? They will get a signal. On one engine, they get an indication. Careful, I'm not saying there's a problem with one engine. Let me put it more precisely. They contact the control tower to report an engine problem and request to return. So after takeoff, they have an issue. What's the issue in question? I'll tell you about the cockpit. I'll show you a picture of the cockpit. It's equipped with Garmin panels. More and more planes today are equipped with screens, and these screens take input from sensors and then display all kinds of information. You have the map, of course, the navigation display, and then you have the engine parameters and everything else. Lots of things. Okay, the aircraft is equipped with Garmin G3X. So it's just screens like that. You have one on the left, one on the right, and so on. Here's what's happening on the left engine. the oil pressure suddenly shows a red X. So when you start a plane with G1000, G3X and others, when you start them, temporarily you'll see a bunch of crosses everywhere. You see a bunch of crosses, and then after that it starts to wake up. What does the cross mean? The cross means I'm not receiving any information from the probe. The cross doesn't mean that the information, that it's a disaster or that the value is wrong. No, it just means I'm not receiving any info from the probe. That's all. You can't infer anything else from it. Shortly after takeoff, he sees the cross on the left engine. Okay, how do we know all this? How do we know all this? Because there's no black box on these planes. But be careful, these screens have memory. They have cards, SanDisk, and others inside. And later we're able to, when they haven't been destroyed by a fire or something else, we're able in the lab to take them apart, clean them, all that. Then after that, we can change the motherboard, repair the broken chips, all that. And then we manage to extract the data. That's how we know it. Investigators today are very good at retrieving data from this type of device. So as I was saying, they have an X on the oil pressure indication. They're going to make a strange inference. They're going to say to themselves, there's a problem with the oil pressure on this engine. So they're going to make a decision in just a few seconds, literally 15 seconds after noticing this. They're going to decide to shut down this engine. It doesn't make any sense. Let me tell you something. I have a friend. Well, actually, I have someone in my family. He's not a friend. They were driving in a Golf, a Volkswagen Golf, on a mountain road, pretty mountainous. A road that's a bit, bumpy. A rock is in the road. He thinks it'll clear. He was with his family. He says it'll pass. Then he goes over the rock and boom, it hits the oil pan. The oil spills out all at once. And he sees the oil pressure warning light come on his dashboard. He sees several warning lights come on. He was a minute from his destination. I thought, with my family and everything, I'd make it. He speeds up a little. 30 seconds later, a big boom. Finished. His engine died after 30 seconds, maybe up to a minute. There was no engine left. About engines. And because stories like this are told among car drivers, people imagine that with airplane piston engines, it's pretty much the same thing. That's not true at all. If you look at the Great Saga, there are videos on this channel about that topic. If you look at the Great Saga where people cross the Atlantic or the Pacific with propeller planes, sometimes you'll see guys, they would take 3 to 4 hours with an engine that was leaking oil before it seized up and stopped. It doesn't stop suddenly. It all depends on the amount lost, of course. But let me tell you something. You take a hot engine. Some guys already did it. I'll show you on YouTube. They tested it. But it was done by builders. It was done by many people. If you take a Continental engine or a Lycoming or another from a light aircraft, you completely drain the oil. You take the engine while it's hot. You heat it up. You drain the oil completely, down to the last drop. You start the engine. It won't stop after 30 seconds. No, it will run pretty much normally for about 5 or 6 minutes, delivering its rated power. Temperatures will slowly rise. It will increase only slightly compared to its potential. Why? Because you're measuring the temperature of an empty oil sump. So that's why your sensor will receive very little oil. From time to time, a drop will hit it. It will show you a value that goes up, but it's not that high. Don't expect the temperature to spike. It won't without oil. What happens is, like I said, 5 or 6 minutes at normal power. After that, it worked for about, since the beginning. I'm talking about the time reference. It's from the moment it started up. It ran for 12, 13, 14 minutes at reduced power, but enough to allow flight. And I think it completely broke down. After 17 or 18 minutes in total. Okay, so typically if I take off and the engine suddenly I see that it's leaking oil, there's a cloud of oil behind and I have oil pressure there on the dashboard. Honestly, I have time to calmly fly the pattern, come back, and land without any stress. I'm not saying the engine will be usable later, but aircraft engines are specifically made with machining that allows these engines to run longer even when all the oil is lost. Okay, there's no specific rule. The FAA basically says a certain amount of time. Okay, but what I'm trying to say is it doesn't just stop suddenly right away. That's it, they're going to infer that because there's an X. It's not true there's no more oil in the engine. It was running normally and all indicators were fine. There was no vibration, nothing at all. And on top of that, they thought it could stop at any moment. So let's shut it down right away. So they do this, they shut down the left engine. So they shut down the left engine. Once they shut down the left engine, they start thinking that, be careful, we can't keep climbing. So they level out the flight path. So at first they go in X. I level out the flight path. I'm going to work, move things around, start reducing the throttle and everything. What will the plane do during that time? It's going to speed up. It's going to speed up, of course. So with the flight path leveled out, the plane keeps accelerating. Landing gear is down. The maximum speed, the VLE with the landing gear down on this aircraft is 140 knots. The speed is rising to 156 knots. All right. It seems like they completely ignored the VLE because when you have to fly with the landing gear down, the first thing to look at is what is the maximum speed I can allow myself with the landing gear down. They exceeded that speed during this phase of flight, but in reality, they had already exceeded it during the previous flight, which went normally. They had exceeded it quite regularly. They didn't seem to know about or pay attention to that speed. So, as they glided along this path, the speed reached 156 to 159. What will happen at some point? At some point, as I told you, this is really final destination. On the wheels, on each landing gear that's in front of the engine. Be careful, it's basically a backwards airplane. The propellers are at the back of the aircraft, not in front. Okay, it wouldn't have happened otherwise. Well, what's going to happen is that on the right landing gear, the one in the middle on the right, there's a metal cover that's going to tear off due to the speed. And is going to hit the propeller at the moment it hits the propeller. We know this because there are very distinctive marks that were found on one of the blades. Only one blade out of the three was recovered. The others were lost for good, somewhere in the swamp. It hits. There's a very clear, very distinctive mark that could only have come from the landing gear hatch door hitting the propeller, which was spinning at full speed. The propeller breaks. Boom. And here we're talking about the second engine. So here, my friends, in a very short time, he takes off, relies on the first engine, reacts to it stopping, and then immediately after, boom. The other engine gives out on them. They end up with a twin engine. Two engines fail. Well, one was shut down. And then that's it. Two engines out, not enough altitude. Out of ideas, you know, as someone would say. So it's not something that's going to end well, unfortunately. So what they're going to do is try to come back and land. Everything I'm telling you about did happen, even if it took a while. Between the moment the wheels left the ground and the second engine stopped, about a minute and a half went by. You know, that's 90 seconds. It was all over. So they want to come back. The problem is, you can't come back if you don't have an engine. So what they're going to do is try to glide the plane. That means trying to stretch the glide. And that's what happened. That's why the best glide speed, by the way, was calculated, then invented, theorized, and taught. That was because of World War II, when the guys wanted to make it back, you know, like the pilots. Look, when the pilots were getting hit by anti-aircraft fire or something, and then they see a field over there, they want to land. And keep in mind, the pilots back then was trained in just a few days. You know, the guys were flying planes with huge engines after just a few days. There wasn't time, and pilots didn't live long. Training someone for a year and a half made no sense if they'd crash in 3 days. So they got 3 hours of training before being sent out. And if he makes it through the week, then you're coming out ahead, you know? So what they noticed at the time, I'm talking about World War II, is that if he goes too fast, if the pilot dives too fast, he won't get very far. and he'll end up crashing pretty close to where he is. Now, if he starts to pull back on the stick and slow down to extend his flight, he'll start pulling back on the stick like this to avoid crashing and slow down. But what will happen is that there comes a point where the speed is too slow and he'll have a trajectory that's too vertical and he won't get very far. So that's why we invented the best glide speed, which allows you to go as far as possible given the circumstances. So, what are our pilots going to do? They're going to start slowing down. That means they'll say to themselves, I want to reach runway 32. So there you go. Then they start pulling back on the stick, slowing down. And what we're going to see in the graphs, my friends, which were captured from the Garmin, you can see the speed. It's very simple. You see the speed dropping. So you have a downward trend with the speed continuously decreasing. And the angle of attack, you have a steady increase. So when it takes off, you see that, okay? Increase, decrease. So obviously we're going to see a plane that will start to descend. It can't maintain its altitude. There's not enough energy. You see, it's a low energy situation. At some point, the lateral control, so the roll, starts to get a little, well, it starts to get a bit mushy. You see, it starts to jerk to the right and left. You start moving the stick all the way from one stop to the other almost just to stay level. All right, that's not good. That's really bad, because if you keep going like that, it's going to end up tipping over to the side. Sometimes it even gets up to 30 degrees, my friends. 30 degrees. That's why I told you at the beginning that you can make it stall. If you really insist, you can make it stall. Or, even if stall is controversial, we don't need the word. You just fall from the sky. You crash. That's it. Even without an aerodynamic stall, you still fell. So what happened is there's a guy walking his dog watching. The air traffic controller starts to get a sense of something, starts to feel like something's wrong with his flight, starts watching them too. And what happens is that suddenly the aircraft, it falls, it dives. The controller literally sees it dive like that. What must have happened inside the aircraft is that at some point, as it was tilting, well, the wings, which were almost critical in terms of stalling, in terms of angle of attack, when the plane tilts 30 degrees, maybe with some rudder input or something else that disrupts symmetry. And at that moment, the aircraft ends up dropping straight down. So it's going to dive toward the ground. So what's serious is that it dives toward the ground. And according to the data, there's an attempt to recover. So the speed suddenly increases. It hits the trees. So it goes through the trees, it passes over the treetops, and it ends up in a frozen lake. A frozen lake with about a meter of water, roughly, partially frozen. It's February, remember? And then there's mud and all that. And so the story where it becomes awful is that the aircraft ends up on its back. And what's terrible is that the accelerations or the forces that were at play during all this sequence I'm telling you about wouldn't have been enough on their own, maybe, to kill the two occupants. Except that it ended up on its back in a frozen lake. And when you look at the autopsy report for one of the occupants, it's the death occurred due to hypothermia and drowning. And for the other, hypothermia, drowning, and impact. So there's one who could have almost made it if the plane had landed flat. You see what I mean? In this case, the aircraft likely bounced on the water at some point and ended up upside down. The people walking by called the police. They arrived at the scene, but they couldn't get close because there was silt, there was mud. Someone described it was up to their knees and all that. They couldn't move forward, you see. And when the rescuers, the firefighters, the sheriffs, all of them arrived at the scene, they couldn't do anything, They found 2 dead bodies inside the plane. Later, it was dismantled and the aircraft cut up. The NTSB, you see some images that I'm showing you where you see the aircraft that's cut up. It's not. The damage doesn't come from the impact. It comes from the extrication and from the fact that they cut it with a grinder to be able to transport it. Well, when you look, you see that they found the reason that started this whole cycle, the reason that began this whole problem. It's that the sensor that measures the temperature, not the temperature, the oil pressure on the left engine. Well, one of the electrical wires was cut. You see, one of the electrical wires was cut. So what happened is that with the friction against the engine, it ended up being cut. And that happened during this last flight. At the moment it was cut, a cross appeared on the screen. At that moment, loss of information, it doesn't mean anything else. They could have continued to their destination. It would have even made more sense as a precaution to decide to come back and land. But shutting down the engine, they didn't need to, because there was absolutely, the engine was working normally. There was no other problem apart from the loss of information, you see? And so what happened is they decided to shut down the engine. They didn't see the speed increasing, but even if they had seen it, probably they didn't take it into account. They forgot all about VLE. Because ferry flying isn't for everyone, unfortunately, because it happens under non-standard conditions. And at that point, there still need to be guys who know what it means to take off with a plane and operate it in circumstances that are normal. Taking off with the landing gear down isn't just, well, I forgot it was down and that's that. No, it's going to involve a certain number of limitations, and it doesn't seem like they took those into account.
Then they lost the second engine, okay?
Now they have to glide. But gliding with a plane, 2 engines out, plus the landing gear down, that doesn't help with gliding. Landing gear down, it's not great, for gliding. So there you go. And they ended up drowning upside down in a lake. It's terrible. So, my friends, I just wanted to talk about this story, which I find full of lessons, really, really full of lessons. But above all, it shows how little things can quickly add up to create a story like this. If the plane hadn't been a canard type, that means if the engines were placed in the front, the landing gear would have been in the back. And if it had lost a piece of sheet metal, the piece would have just fallen off, and that would be it.
It wouldn't have hit the propellers.
The propellers, when they're in the back on those planes, that means any part of the airframe, the fuselage and all, that comes off, it inevitably ends up hitting a propeller that's in the back. You see,
There you go, my friends.
thank you for watching. Thanks to those who support this channel by subscribing on Patreon and on the paid section of YouTube, where there are exclusive videos that aren't public. There are many now, and more are on the way. Let me remind you that my book, Astrology, is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle formats. And then I'll see you in the next video, and thanks again for watching until the end. See you very soon.